Alright, welcome back guys. So here we have the Betaflight F3 flight controller. And it's not just a flight controller, it's a flight controller and PDB built into one. I don't know if you can tell, but the copper pads here are much thicker than they are on your typical flight controller. Not only that, but it's advertised as an flight controller, that grammar kills me, but a flight controller that supports every Betaflight feature. So if you're asking yourself, what can this flight controller do? The better question is, what can't it do? The most notorious feature is going to be the chipset needed for the built-in on-screen display that is capable of being used with Betaflight's OSD feature. There are other flight controllers on the market that has this feature. It's becoming more and more common because it's an amazing feature. Like I said before, it's not just nice having a built-in OSD. It's the fact that through the OSD menu, you can change your PIDs, rates, expos, and much more. And recently, they've incorporated what's needed for the newer video transmitters that use smart audio, meaning through the OSD menu, you can also change your VTX bands, channels, and power output. I find that to be so great because this keeps me from having to bring a laptop into the field with me, because that's just extra weight and something else I hate carrying around. And speaking of, I've already received a lot of questions on which is better between this, the Omnibus, the DYS F4. There's also another one, I think it's the Dronin something, I can't remember the name of it. And there's going to be more and more coming up on the market, but at the end of this video, I'll give you my opinions on which one is better. I hate doing that, but I mean, you guys keep asking. But anyway, let's look at all the features on this first, and then we will get into that. So as I said before, we've got the built-in PDB, built-in on-screen display, built-in voltage regulator with 3 amps of output for the 5-volt pins, built-in SD card reader. It's got the boot button instead of the boot pads, which if it really doesn't matter anymore if you've been keeping up with Betaflight. As long as you have Betaflight firmware on it, you no longer have to press the button or jump the pads to flash new firmware. It just works as long as it has a virtual COM port, which this does have. So speaking of, this has the virtual COM port instead of the CP2102 driver, meaning that you get 3 UARTs, one here, here, and here, and none of the 3 UARTs are shared with the USB. It also uses SPI instead of I2C, meaning we can get the full 8K, dedicated pins for your buzzer and LED. This pin here can be either 5 volts or 3.3 volts, so for you Spectrum satellite receiver guys, you can use the ground, power, and then signal pin here. To be able to get 3.3 volts out of this pin, you select it here. So on the left we have 5 volts, right side 3.3 volts. So you would just bridge the right pad to the middle pad with a drop of solder, and that will produce 3.3 volts on this pin. We've got the camera video going into this pin, video out to your video transmitter on this pin. Then this RAM pin, you can select if you want 5 volts of output on it or the full voltage of the battery. For you Turnigy guys, if you are like me and using the Turnigy Evolution, this does support iBus. Not only does it support iBus, but iBus works on all 3 of the UARTs, so pick and choose whichever one you want. For you Spectrum guys, if you are using this pin to connect your receiver, keep in mind that this pin is shared with UART number 2, so if you do add an additional device, don't put it on UART 2. Use one of these 2 over here. And that's pretty much it. Now, I think a lot of these questions that I get as far as performance and which is better comes from this having a F3 processor. So let's talk about why the F3 processor doesn't matter and the performance will be exactly the same compared to the Omnibus F4 or DYS F4. So in the past, F3 processors could not run the full 8K. As I've said before, I shoot for a CPU load of 35% and below. Some guys will disagree and say it's a little bit lower. Some will say it's a little bit higher. I just go for 35. So if we go down here and set it to 8K and 8K, like I said before, this would lock up the flight controller with a CPU load of 100%. It wouldn't arm, it wouldn't fly, it's not going to do anything. But since Betaflight 3.1 and newer firmware, Boris B, which is the creator of Betaflight, and I believe also he had either part in designing this flight controller or he did the whole thing. I don't know. He had something to do with it. Point being, they reworked the code to where you can now run 8K, 8K on F3 flight controllers as long as they have SPI instead of I2C. So now we see we're sitting at 33%, which is still great. Not only that, but that's with the accelerometer turned on and telemetry, black box, SD card, and OSD. We'll even add in air mode. And we see that didn't even change anything, and we even have the current meter running. Now if you only fly in acro flight mode, then you don't need the accelerometer, which does take up a good portion of the CPU load. So let's try it again. And now we're down to 22%. So now I hope you can rest assured knowing that it really doesn't matter that this has an F3 processor, because it's going to perform just like any F4 processor. Now the F4 processors, their CPU load does get down, I mean, I would say on average 4%, but 4% isn't going to perform any better than 22%. You really won't see a notice in performance until you get past, like I said, that 35% mark. Or it could be slightly higher, some guys will disagree, but as long as it's below 35%, doesn't matter if it's 35% versus 4% or 20% versus 4%, it's going to be the same thing. Now in some aspects, this actually is better than the Omnibus. With the Omnibus, the biggest problem is its voltage regulator. That style and type of regulator gets really hot. I'm editing this and I just wanted to clarify, I'm referring to the standard Omnibus flight controllers, not the Pro versions. The standard ones use the really hot voltage regulator. The Pro versions use the same type of regulator that the Betaflight F3 uses. If I had a dime for every time someone asked me if that's normal, I'd be a rich guy. But yes, that is normal for that flight controller and that regulator. The problem though is it gets so hot that, like I said before in my video on how to connect the camera and video transmitter to the Omnibus, I said do not power both of those off the board, because you will overload the regulator and it will fry. The other problem is it actually gets so hot, some guys have reported, and this has actually happened to me recently, it gets so hot that it affects the processor. I've had the processor, it just resets itself in mid-flight and your multimeter just falls to the ground. It's rare. Out of my 7 Omnibus flight controllers, only one of them has that problem, and I did fix that problem by powering the board with a separate 5-volt regulator off a PDB. But point is, you're not going to have that problem with this board because of the different type of regulator. So it's not going to overheat, it's not going to reset itself in mid-flight, and you can actually power the camera and video transmitter off this board with no problems. Now the downside is, because the PDB is built into the flight controller, if you ever crash and you rip one of these pads off, could be your main XT60 battery lead pad, it could be a pad going to one of your ESCs. If any of these pads rip off, this flight controller is done. I mean, I do have a complete repairs series of videos where I show you how to replace everything on a flight controller. But pads, that is one thing that you cannot fix, and at that point it's now trash. So if you do use this board, be sure you secure everything and do everything you possibly can to make sure that does not happen. So now with all of that said, which do I think is better between the Betaflight F3 and Omnibus? I can't speak for the DYS F4 yet because I haven't made that video series yet. It's coming up next. But between these two flight controllers, I really can't pick. I'd say it's a draw. It really just comes down to personal preference. The Betaflight F3 isn't going to overheat like the standard versions of Omnibus. Like I already said, the Pro versions do use the same type of regulator that doesn't overheat. But compared to the standard Omnibus, this one, you can power the camera and video transmitter off the board without overheating it or frying anything. You also don't have to worry about the processor resetting itself in mid-flight. But at the same time, like I said, if you rip a pad off of this board, it's now trash, where with the Omnibus, you really don't have to worry about that. And I've also shown you, giving you guys videos on how to replace the voltage regulator and processor both. I will also add that if you do plan on using a 4-in-1 ESC, then I would use any other flight controller other than the Betaflight F3, because trying to wire a 4-in-1 ESC into this would be a major headache. So please, no video request on doing that, because I'm not. So just to wrap it up, it's just personal preference. Do you want a PDB built into your flight controller or not? And do you plan on using a 4-in-1 ESC or not? But that's going to do it. Look in the description below to find a link to the videos I'm making next on how to connect everything to this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.